Hello and welcome to Two Man Power Trip of Wrestling. Host JP John Poz with me today. Special guest. He's the author of Titan Shrinking: How Wrestling's Muscle Lost Its Power, and a lot of the other Titan series. James Dixon. James, what's going on? How you doing?
Hey man, good to be here. I'm very good, thank you.
So what is going on in your world? Tell us about the new book, a part of the series. I guess it's no longer a trilogy. You're adding to it.
Well, I was bullied into it, to be honest, mate. So I wrote the original trilogy. I think I started a decade ago now. The first one came about Titan Shrnking, because there was no book about 1995 in the WWF, and I thought it was a fascinating time period. So I wrote that, and it did well, and then it turned into a trilogy. It seemed to have a natural conclusion with the dawn of the Attitude Era, and I thought I was done. And then a lot of people pestered me, "Oh, you need to write more Titan books." I'm like, well, there's nothing to write about, because who cares about the WWF doing well in 98, 99, right? There's no real story there. It's just it's doing great. I mean, there's a WCW story, but that book's been done and done very well. So I had nothing more to say on that. And then Kenny McIntosh of Inside the Ropes continued to pester me and harass me about it. He said, "Oh man, you've got to write another one. You've got to write another one." I was like, "Well, what's it going to be about?" And he said, "What about 92? I was like, 92, interesting." And I thought about it, and so much happens in 92. The WWF changes an awful lot. You know, with Hogan leaving is a big part of it, obviously, and it really is the start, or at least the embryonic stages of the new generation era. And it leads very nicely into a new trilogy about 93, 94, which ends with the steroid trial, obviously, and then goes into the 95 stuff that we've already got leading into Attitude and the rebirth of the WWF, I guess. So I thought, yeah, okay, I'll give it a go and see if I've still got it in me 10 years later. And I'm told I do. So I'm quite pleased with how it's turned out.
Yeah, you got Titan Sinking, Titan Shattered, Titan Screwed. So now, of course, it's a Titan Shrinking. I mean, so makes perfect sense. I love it. It's no longer a trilogy, though. It's I don't even what do you call it if it's four? I don't even know.
Well, I guess it's the start of a new trilogy, so it's a prequel trilogy that we're into now.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, Star Wars
the
style. Yeah.
Star Wars style. I mean, hopefully they'll be better received than the Star Wars prequels. But I mean, the name was difficult because it made so much sense. Shrinking, because the roster itself was shrinking in every sense. The WWF as an entity was shrinking, but it was so very close to sinking. I was like, well, people understand the difference, I'm sure.
Yes, definitely. So in that era, obviously, the steroid stuff, I mean, everything's going on. I mean, it's just such a crazy time period. And then they go over to England and there's still huge draws, drawing 80,000 people at Wembley for SummerSlam 92. So it's a weird, and Hogan's kind of, gone essentially, he's hardly there. It's a weird time period, WWF.
It's a really weird time. I mean, it's the first real challenge I think Vince McMahon had in terms of the popularity of his company and the viability of his company without Hogan. And so the book kind of starts in 91 because a lot of what informs 92 is in 91 with Hogan on Arsenio Hall and the various steroid things involving George the Horian and such. That all informs what happens in 92, and then the raft of scandal that then follows, and the WWF and wrestling becomes this hot button topic, and Hogan becomes the center of it in many ways, and a lightning rod for controversy, and Vince has to move on from that. He recognizes quite quickly that it's a problem to have Hogan at the front and center of this, and it's all really, the book's all about how does he move on from Hogan and what does he do, like, while also putting out these fires left, right, and center to do with steroid sex scandals and drug scandals, drug raids, various different guys leaving, because it wasn't just Hogan. They also lost in the same year Legion of Doom, Roddy Piper, Jake Roberts, Sid, Warrior, Davey Boy, and obviously some of those guys were around a little bit longer than others. And yet you've got this fascinating juxtaposition of the WWF really on the lowest ebb it's been since Vince took over in North America, whereas in Europe it's as big as it was ever been, really, and to this day I think that's accurate. And 1992, and I think a lot of North American fans maybe don't realize just how big it was. Obviously they're aware of SummerSlam and whatnot, but I don't think fans outside of the UK realize just how huge the WWF was in 92. It really was the peak here, despite everything that was going on. And I thought that was quite a fascinating story as well, like to balance. It's like this yin yang going on.
It is crazy that like it could be so popular somewhere else, but not as not as popular here in the States. It's like dwindling. Still, to me, still good, but I mean dwindling obviously, and you losing all those stars. But like, why did it? It just accelerate so much in Europe, though.
It was largely down to the TV deal it had over here on Sky Sports. Sky was our equivalent of cable TV, and that's something we never had before. We always had terrestrial TV, which is we had every TV in the country had these 4 channels at the time, and that was all anybody watched. That's all we had, and they were accessible to everybody. And cable came in a little bit earlier than that, but it really started to peak in the early 90s. And the WWF and the Simpsons were kind of front and center of that. They were the 2 sort of entities that you'd see on the side of all of the buses and posts and billboards. And Hogan and the WWF was very much the selling point, as well as sort of, English football. They were the selling points of Sky. And it became this hot, exciting thing. And it just took off in the playgrounds over here with children, first of all. And I think it helped that there was a couple of things in place at the time. So Sky obviously being one of them, but then the WWF came over here a lot more. So they were a lot more accessible. And then you had Davey Boy Smith, who was a huge national icon for sure. And again, like in 92, the British Bulldog was a bigger name in the UK than Hulk Hogan, for sure, by a mile as well. And everyone knew who the British Bulldog was, and it just took off. It just captured lightning in a bottle for a second time, but for the first time over here, and it just so happened that it wasn't Hogan and Andre the Giant and people like that who were leading the charge. It was Bret Hart and Davey Boy, and that's why a lot of guys who were on SummerSlam 92 are very, very fondly remembered over here, whereas in the US, maybe not so much.
Yeah, talk about Bret for a second here, because I feel like Bret the Hitman Hart almost as popular as Davey Boy, obviously, who's the countryman. How is that possible? Because it does seem like he was so over in all of Europe, really.
So I once heard someone say that there's been wrestlers who are more over than Bret Hart, but there's never been a wrestler who's over like Bret Hart. And once you're a Bret Hart fan, you are a Bret Hart fan for life. I was on a tour with him with Inside the Ropes a couple of weeks ago over here in the UK, and again, like fans queue for hours and hours just to meet him. Just to meet him for a couple of minutes and get a picture with him. Like he is still just as popular now, having not wrestled for 25 years as he ever was, and Bret just had this charisma and this likability, and I think that a no-nonsense attitude, that that resonates with Brits. I think they like that. I don't know if there's an element of you maybe reminded some of the older fans of what they used to watch in British wrestling back in the day, a little bit, but with obviously more razzmatazz. And I'll tell you, man, it was split. You would think that going into SummerSlam, because I was, I think, 8 years old going into SummerSlam 92. And you would think that everyone was behind Davey Boy because he was the countryman. But no, it was the playground was split, and it was like gang wars, It was you're either a Bret guy or a Davey Boy guy, and you didn't hang out with the opposite side until SummerSlam was over. It was really quite interesting. And I don't really know if there's any specific reason that it was Bret. I mean, I guess he was just popular and pushed at the time, and when you're young, you gravitate towards success, I suppose. But yeah, he just had this, I don't know, this aura about him, I suppose, and more so than anyone else, really.
It's crazy. Like when you think about it, it's like, oh, Davey Boy's going to be, he's going to be the big baby face, and Bret's going to be the big heel, and not at all. I mean, yeah, it's crazy how split it was. He was so over in that match. It's crazy. Awesome match, but it's just insane to think that, wow, Bret's as over as Davey Boy, and Davey Boy's home country.
Yeah. I mean, you won't see anything like it usually. It's usually a very partisan crowd. I mean, when Bret himself was doing all the Canadian stuff in '97, you would never have got that split reaction in Canada. They were always going to be pro Bret and the Harts, right? But in the US, it was obviously the way around. but yeah, over here it was always split really even, and Bret was a huge star. I think him being as successful as he was in Europe is one of the reasons he got the belt, at the end of '92, which is covered in the book, because they had options, the WWF, of who we're going to go with. Ric Flair's got this ear injury, and he's not the guy. He's an NWA guy. He's not a WWF guy. He's just kind of holding the belt. Who's the next Hogan? And it was going to be Warrior, but then he wasn't right for it, and Vince, didn't. I don't think Vince was thrilled with the numbers that Warrior was drawing after he came back, and he kind of wanted to go younger, but ironically, the two guys he landed on were Bret and Tito Santana, and people often don't believe that it was those two, but it really was, and the reason for Tito was because the WWF was realizing in North America we're really struggling, so let's move into a different territory, let's expand out of North America, and there was two options. One of them was expanding to South America and Mexico, and the other was expanding to Canada and Europe more than they already were. And I think the issue they had with Tito, as well as him, I think he's a little bit older as well, but I think one of the issues was the peso was pretty low at the time, and also the logistics of bringing the entire crew to South America and Mexico, as well as sort of getting into that scene where there's already a lot of wrestling in Mexico, was quite difficult. So, and Europe had obviously been, it's a proven commodity. You can charge a lot more money. People are going to pay it, and they did. And obviously they'd had a lot of success with SummerSlam as well. So Bret was the obvious choice really at that point. But it's quite interesting. I think if it wasn't for SummerSlam, maybe that wouldn't have happened.
And even somewhere in South America, I believe, if I remember correctly, unless it was Spain, but I remember Tito got a huge win over Undertaker. They're like, whoa, what's going on here? They're like restarting a push for El Matador. Tito Santana here. He's getting big wins.
That was Spain in '91 in Barcelona. Ironically, it was as Tito Santana rather than El Matador, and then they shifted him like a couple of weeks later. Is that, well, what was the point of that then?
Yeah.
But, I mean, Tito was, he wasn't thrilled. He thinks, Tito said himself, like he was disappointed, as you can imagine. But I can't see it. Like, as good as Tito was, he'd been around a long, long time by then. He'd been beaten by everybody. He was almost like a rung above the jobber territory by '92, especially with the gimmick. So, and you can heat anybody up, give him a few wins, give him a big win. You can do it. But I think Bret was the obvious guy who was on the rise and had been for the last couple of years.
And so respected. Even like you would watch the crowd, they would like him. He quiet charisma, but he was charismatic, and they loved his entrance. They thought he looked cool. The Hitman nickname, the shades, everything was cool. But you always get that respect. Like the crowd's like, this guy's an awesome wrestler. Like everybody gets so into his matches that the live crowd, they really, really took to Bret. Yeah,
I mean, Bret obviously in the ring was incredible. That does help, and I think everything about him, he's got a great entrance music that helps.
Yeah.
The sunglasses gimmick, we're giving it to the fans, that helps because it makes him relatable. His work in the ring obviously is pristine. Like the pink and black is striking. He ticks all the right boxes, I guess. So to me it was the obvious choice. Who else could they have had in that spot? I mean, and somebody, I think it was Nails, said, you'd want as a company, you would want Bret Hart as your champion. A guy like Bret Hart, because the way he conducts himself, the way he carries himself, the way the respect that he has from everybody, from all of his his peers and from people who work backstage. He's not what Shawn Michaels was a couple of years later when he was a problem. And right. As good as he was, and as much as Shawn ticked all those boxes, there was problems with Shawn, and you wouldn't get that with Bret. At worst, he'd turn up late. But not because of any sort of demons or drama. It was just, he just happened to be late.
Right. The thing is too, obviously it's Titan Shrnking, so the steroid scandal is around. He's the perfect guy because he's not a steroid guy. He's a pure wrestler. He seems like if this were real, like he would probably be the champion because he's the best wrestler. You know what I mean? So I feel like just in general, he was the best choice to go with because of all the situations wrapped around Zahorian and Vince and Hogan and Warrior and everybody else.
Yeah, I mean that's the other reason, isn't it? It had to be someone who didn't look like they were blatantly, taking a lot of steroids, and that was quite limiting, I guess, for Vince because a lot of his roster, I think it's quite safe to say, were taking a lot of steroids, and a lot of those guys were gone by the time Bret got the belt anyway. I guess I won't name names, but it's obvious, like from who they had a year earlier to who they didn't have, who was taking steroids. It was obvious, all the jacked up guys were gone pretty much, and Vince replaced that with guys who were big in a different way, either really, really tall or really, really wide, rather than really, really muscly. Warrior being the exception briefly, and Davey Boy, but obviously they both got canned for using a human growth hormone in that year as well. So it was, Vince was quite limited in his options. What else was he going to do? Go back to Randy Savage? He tried that. He wasn't convinced by it. He thought Randy was too old. It didn't really work. Undertaker didn't need the belt. He was not that kind of character. He's not the face of the company in the same way. So who else is there? Rick Martel was an option. It was never going to happen. He was too old, and as well, and you've been healed too long, I think. And again, you can turn people and change things, but there really wasn't another option. And I think Vince almost resented that. I think he went with Bret because Bret was the right option, but he never truly, and Bret would say this himself countless times, that he never truly believed in Vince. I mean, there was in Bret, sorry, there was never a time where Vince really strapped the rocket to Bret and went, "This is the guy." It always, in hindsight, seems that Bret was holding the belt for the next guy, whether that be Shawn or Diesel or Austin or whoever, and which is a shame because, like I say, he was so popular, and the fact that people will point to the fact he didn't draw like Hogan. Well, of course he didn't. The company, the WWF, as an entity, wasn't drawing anymore, and it didn't matter who you had on top at that point.
Plus, I don't think anybody really drew like Hogan. Maybe Austin eventually, but really nobody drew like Hogan anyway. So it's not like to knock on Bret, but then just look at the guys after Bret: Diesel, Yoko, Sid, HBK. They didn't draw as good as Bret. So kind of one of those kind of things where it's like, kind of, go look at it and not just, with blinders on. You got to really look at it from the whole perspective.
Yeah, of course. There's always, many sides to a story, and that's one of the fun parts of doing these books, is to sort of delve into the minutiae of the details of why certain things happen and how they come about, and why these decisions are made, and what's really going on behind them as well, because it can be fascinating, and it's interesting to put yourself in the shoes of some of the people involved and go, well, what would I have done? Like, what could you have done? And sometimes it makes things make a lot more sense than they seem on the surface.
And when you look at it, the booking of Bret too, even just going back to '92, I feel like he was never really booked strong at all. But like, okay, he beats Flair, he's a world champ, but he beats him on basically a dark match of a house show, in essence of a TV taping. So that's kind of like crazy. Then he's feuding with Shawn Michaels, who was the Intercontinental Champion that nobody saw as a world title contender in 1992. Then he's feuding with a rookie and Razor Ramon, and he's feuding with another rookie, Yokozuna. So not like they strapped a rocket and pushed him. Like, usually that champ would beat like Warrior and Jake the Snake, and he would beat Hogan or whatever, and you give him the push to the next level. None of that happened at all.
It's tricky because it's a similar situation to what happened with Warrior in '90. So he wins the title from Hogan, but then who's he got to work with?
Rude,
Perfect. Got Rude, but he's already beaten Rude, for 2 years. And then he's got Perfect, and Hogan's already beaten Perfect, and Perfect lost at WrestleMania as well. And it's like, well, that's what use is that? So there's no one from to work with. And it was very similar for Bret. There was Hogan couldn't put him over. Hogan was gone. Warrior, there was talk that was going to happen, Warrior and Bret, but that was if Warrior agreed to turn heel, which he flat out refused to do. And that was never going to happen as a babyface match because Warrior would have been popular. It would have hurt Bret. Probably not more popular than Bret, but he would have been popular enough that it could have hurt him. So Vince wouldn't have done that. Right. Hogan obviously wasn't around, as we say. He wasn't going to do Undertaker, who's your other big star, because again, babyface guy. So all his top stars, Randy Savage, another one, all baby faces. So what heels does he have? He doesn't have any. So he did have Jake, but he lost Jake. I think if Jake had stayed around, Jake would have been a main event guy by the end of '92 as a heel, probably working with the top guys, because you needed someone like that, an experienced heel who was established, and they didn't have it, so they had to scramble, and that's why Vince is coming up with all these crazy characters. You know, your Papa Shango's, and Doink the Clown and Damien Demento and all this kind of stuff, and Shango. By the time Bret worked with Shango, he'd already lost to Warrior everywhere, so he was no good. He wasn't a legitimate threat, and there was nobody at all for him to work with. And as for the title change itself, I mean, that did come around earlier than it was supposed to because of Flair's injury. You know, so Flair had worked a match with Warrior, and this all obviously covered in the book. But Flair worked this match with Warrior and took I think it was a back body drop and landed funny, and it sent his equilibrium off, and he got an inner ear injury. And Flair could barely stand. He was going dizzy whenever he did anything. And he just called Vince, said, look, he already knew that Bret was going to be beating him for the title. He was fine with it. But he called Vince, said, look, we need to do it now. So Vince was like, well, I want the cameras to be there. So the TV taping is the obvious place to do it. And it's in Canada, so it'll go down well. You know, I can't risk waiting any longer because, you know, in theory, it could have been at Survivor Series. And people obviously will point to, well, Flair was at Survivor Series. Yeah, he was at a tag match, and he still wasn't 100%. But at the time, they didn't know for sure that Flair would make Survivor Series, right? So it's got to be done now. Let's get the belt off him. Let's do it. And that's why it was done that way. And the knock-on effect of that was that Davey Boy's IC title reign got cut short because Vince didn't want to have two babyface champions at the same time. And again, it was always the plan that Davey Boy would win it. He would defend it until whenever, maybe the Rumble, probably, you know, because he was supposed to defend it at Survivor Series against the Mountie until that match got scrapped. And then obviously Davey got fired before and everything. But that was the working plan. And then when they had to do the belt switch with Bret, then Davey had to do the belt switch with Shawn much earlier than planned. So, you know, these things kind of happened as a result of situation and circumstance.
But it seems like everything's going against him in like 92. Like everything was in flux. Like nothing seemed smooth or like kind of the way it should be. Even Mr. Perfect coming out of retirement, I don't think that was supposed to happen because Warrior ends up leaving. You know what I mean? It's just a lot of stuff just didn't work out in late 92 for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Perfect coming back, he didn't really want to do it, to be honest. Kurt was quite happy collecting his insurance policy. It cost Vince a lot of money to get Kurt back because he had to basically buy out that policy, you know, pay Kurt, because Kurt was just coming to work, announcing, managing Ric Flair and not taking any bumps and getting paid real well for it, you know, as well as getting his Lloyd's of London policy on top of that. So why would you get back in the ring, be on the road and take all the bumps for less money? You're not going to do that. So Vince had to pay out, you know, a lot of money for that. And again, it was circumstantial. What choice did he have? He just lost two of his biggest babyface stars in Davey Boy and Warrior. He had to do something. There was talk, but never really serious, of Hogan coming back, you know, around that time because he was interested. You know, I think they kind of felt everything had died down enough, which he probably had, that he could have come back then. But there was problems between Hogan and Randy Savage because Elizabeth had left Randy and Randy blamed Hogan. And, you know, even though that's not necessarily what happened, but he did. So they were fractious, you know. And so you're not going to put Hogan and Randy together so soon afterwards because that's going to be a recipe for disaster. And then Hogan wasn't really keen on any of the creative ideas that were fed to him anyway for his comeback yet. So obviously it does happen a few months later, but, you know, it wasn't happening for Survivor Series. So it's, again, what option does he have? Big Boss Man was sort of talked about, Tatanka was talked about, but can you imagine? It's not particularly exciting, right? It's not, who would care? You know, those guys are just guys on the card anyway. Like it's nothing interesting. So they needed something, and Vince talked Kurt into it and paid for it, you know?
Yeah, unfortunately, because that Lloyd's of London, which seems like all the boys were using that Lloyd's of London insurance.
Well, I mean, Flair had one as well, and he was 1 day away. And there's a story in the book about this with the inner ear thing. He was 1 day away from calling them and going, right, I need to cash in on my policy. And then the day he was going to do that, he woke up and it was gone. So he called his dad, and his dad, who was a physician, And he said, look, this thing's gone. I was going to call in this policy. And his dad said, don't do that. Be honest, be legitimate. So he said, okay. So he didn't. But Flair could have retired in 92.
Crazy. And he was still wrestling, 30-something years later. So it's pretty crazy if he retired in 92, right? Oh, my God. Man, imagine.
He'd have come back, I think, at some point either way.
Yeah, 100%. Crazy thing too is, okay, you got the Zahorian stuff, you got the steroid, trial going. I mean, you got so much stuff going on, like all negative stuff. But then eventually they're going to bring back Hogan anyway. You know what I mean? So it's like they're hoping it dies down. Vince needs Hogan. He needs a little jolt. But if certain circumstances worked out and you were able to do something different as far as booking Bret, would you need to bring back Hogan? It's a lot of like what ifs, as far as 92, early 93 WWF.
One of the issues that Vince had in 92 was that he lost Pat Patterson for a couple of months.
Yep.
Because of the sex scandal. And he also didn't have Bruce Pritchard, who he'd fired a year or two earlier. So his sort of support network, the people who kept him, his booking and his creative and all this kind of thing, who kept him right, they were gone. So the brain trust wasn't there for a while. And as a result, Vince kind of got out of hand. And without Pat between sort of WrestleMania and SummerSlam, that's when a lot of these crazy gimmicks start cropping up and these silly angles with, Shango cursing Warrior and throwing up everywhere and all this kind of stuff. And which is, as a kid, was fun, but, obviously it's
ridiculous,
quite a departure.
Yeah.
So it's a big departure from what WWF fans, I guess, we're used to. Because of that, he was unchecked, and he did need to reel it back in. And obviously, he did bring Pat back, and he rehired Bruce, and that's when they kind of got a more clear picture of where they were going, what they were doing, and got a little bit more direction, in theory, anyway. But it was hard for him because almost on a weekly basis, and this is one of the things I was very keen to try and do in the book, was condense all this stuff that happened into this, much easier to digest timeline, because there's been a lot of great reporting on, say, the steroid scandal and the sex scandal by like Dave Meltzer and John Aretzi and Wade Keller and others, at the time. But they'll report what happened in the moment, but then what's the follow-up for that story? There's no time for that because there's something else happens the next week, and it can be very confusing because it's just this massive information. So I was like, right, there needs to be a very sort of cohesive timeline as to when all this stuff happened. And when I started putting it together, like, I couldn't believe, even though I was, really familiar with all the stuff, I still couldn't believe just how condensed all of this bad stuff happening to them at once was. It was one day it'd be, a sex scandal involving, Pat Patterson or Terry Garvin or Mel Phillips or whoever, or Vince himself. And then it'd be, a drug raid in St. Louis. And then there'd be a Jim Neidhart throwing a TV at somebody, Chief Strongbow, I think it was, and getting fired. And then Marty Jannetty is getting fired for getting caught with drugs and, which kills a WrestleMania program. And then the WWF is launching its Body Stars TV show amidst all of this. And then there's a WrestleMania to think about where you've got Hogan, the Golden Goose, leaving. You've got Jake decided on the day that he's leaving. Piper's going after that show as well. Sid had already told him at Royal Rumble that he was quitting, and Vince had to talk him into staying. And then Sid failed a drug test the week before WrestleMania, which Vince, just allowed to pass until Sid didn't want to do business with Warrior, and then he got suspended and then got fired. So it's like you've got all this stuff happening, and it's like, okay, we've solved that problem, but he's 10 more problems, and it was the whole year is like that, and that extends to, Flair's injury and Warrior and Davey getting fired and Nails, and Vince, that whole situation, and there's a lot of stuff, and it's never ending. So once Vince got Pat and Bruce back, it made it a little bit easier, I guess, to manage and put out the fires, but he was everywhere at once. It must have, and say what you will about Vince, but it must have been difficult. I can imagine it was very difficult that year.
And that's why they wanted you to write this book so bad, because there's so much going on in 92. It's crazy. Like Hawk and Animal, right? Like, do they really lose the tag titles? You know what I mean? But they want them to lose the tag titles. They want to put Money Inc. together, right? I know you talk about that in the book. And then Kerry Von Erich, too. He's like forging prescriptions and stuff. So it's like one thing after. Nails beats up Vince. One thing after another. Holy moly. What a just horrendous year.
Oh, it's wild. I mean, it's one of those things, like I say, where you know the stories, but it's about sort of getting them in the right order and going, man, whoa, that happened a week after that. WrestleMania was like 3 days after this crazy scenario. And, you've got all this going on at once. And it's almost too much to think about when you're not involved in it. So I can only imagine what it must have been like when you are. And then again, when you're doing that without your team behind you, it must be quite tricky. And, I can't say I have a lot of sympathy for Vince in general, but like either way, I can imagine it was quite tough. So, yeah, I mean, it's all really fascinating. It's all like, it's a really, really interesting year in terms of what goes on behind the scenes. And I remember showing the book to somebody in the business before it was released, and they were like, I'm like more than halfway in, and I've only got to WrestleMania. I'm like, yeah, that's how crazy the start, at least, of that year was. And then, it kind of, WrestleMania hits, Sid leaves, and then nothing happens until SummerSlam. Just nothing at all. Everything just goes quiet. A few new characters come in and whatnot, but then it goes into the Europe thing, and that becomes the shining light, right? The Europe stuff is the shining light for the WWF and SummerSlam in that year, because otherwise, people look back fondly on 92, but it was a horrible year. Whereas if you took SummerSlam out of that, I think maybe they wouldn't look back so fondly, because it was kind of masks the drama that was going on.
Yeah, with 92, it's crazy because it starts off with Royal Rumble 92, arguably the greatest Royal Rumble match ever. I mean, just Heenan and Gorilla on commentary is awesome. It's just like, it seems like, oh, this is great. Now, it's Flair Hogan, and then that doesn't happen. And then Sid Hogan is changed. Then it's Flair Savage. It's like, man, just I don't know. It's just like snake bitten, if you will, just going on and on. And then Sid, like you said, he leaves, and then Warrior's a problem, and then this is a problem, and Hogan leaves. It's 92 is maybe the most insane year in WWE history, WWF history.
I think it's that or 97. I would say it's that one of the two. I think it's, in terms of the sheer different amount of things that were happening, it's probably 92. Because I mean, 97 obviously has one big thing, really big thing that happens that changes everything. But whereas 92 has just so many and so many mistakes by so many people who should know better, in terms of the decision making that goes on, and whether that be, behind the scenes or the wrestlers. And for me, the challenge was, a lot of this stuff is known. You've heard about Nails being up Vince. You've heard about Hogan on Arsenio Hall. You've heard about Vince on Donahue. All this kind of stuff. Probably watched footage of some of those things as well. And the challenge was, how do you write a book about it without just going over old ground? So to me, it's almost like a compendium. It's like you put all these stories together and get a logical flowing narrative out of them, and then try and make sense of it. Try and make then sense of the actions, and write some of the misconceptions. Because, for example, Sid leaving's a great one. People, because of what Sid said in shoot interviews, I guess, go, oh, well, Sid didn't fail the drugs test before WrestleMania because he said he didn't. It's like, yeah, but he's lying. Like that's what you have to understand. Like, he's lying about that, because if you research it properly, obviously, which I've certainly tried to do, there is a piece in the Observer just before WrestleMania about a major star from WrestleMania's main events headliner has failed a drugs test a week out. Doesn't say who it is,
right?
But that no action's going to be taken. It's like, okay, well, it can only be one of four people, really. It can only be Hogan, Flair, Savage, or Sid. It ain't Sid. It ain't Flair, and it ain't Savage, and it's probably not Hogan, given everything going on with Hogan, right? It's the fact that he's the lightning rod guy. If he failed a test, that was hidden, and someone found out, the explosion that would cause. So it's obviously Sid, and I mean, just which of the four looks like they're on steroids in WrestleMania 8? It's like it's clear.
So
And the story about him, what he actually did, he didn't fail. He falsified the test. I think people probably have heard this story. You know, Harvey Whippleman did the gimmick where he peed in the bottle for him, and they caught it. And some of the interviews we did, like, people do talk about, you know, yeah, we always used to do that. You know, everyone did it, so just got caught. And you know, you'd have someone who was clean who would do it for you, and they'd have, or someone bought a bunch of the bottles that you pee into, and so they had them. So they'd give you a bottle, and then you just kind of take it away, and then give them that one back. Like, oh, look, one I made earlier, and carry it around with them. So, you know, you've got that with Sid, and then what ends up happening is Vince says, "Look, I won't suspend you. You know, let's do WrestleMania, because he doesn't want to change WrestleMania a week before." But Sid's already told him at Royal Rumble, "I want to leave. I'm not happy here. I'm not making enough money. I don't like all the political BS going on between you and Hogan. Like, I don't want to be part of it. Like, I just want to go home." And Vince had said, "Look, just stay through WrestleMania and European tour, and things will change, whatever." So Sid stays, and then fails the test, and then Vince has got him because Vince hasn't suspended him. So Sid's still getting his payoff. So Sid now owes him a favor. So it's a reason that Sid's going to stay, right? Because Vince knows he needs him. Then Sid works with Warrior on a couple of house shows after the European tour in, you know, April, I think it was. And the agents and Vince want Warrior to kick or get up from the powerbomb, no sell the powerbomb, shake the ropes, get rid of Sid, you know, do some sort of non-finish. And Sid's like, "Nope, he's not killing my finish. No, there's no way. Like, I'm not doing it." And then he didn't like Warrior anyway, because Warrior acted backstage like Warrior acted in front of the camera, I guess, you know, doing his gimmick and reaching for the heavens when they were planning a match and stuff. And Sid's like, "Is this guy for real? Like, what is this?" Right. So by this point, Sid's had enough. So he's like, "Look, I'll do that finish, but if he kicks out or gets up from this powerbomb, like, I'm leaving. Like, I'm going to walk out the building. I'm not coming back." And Vince was like, "Nope, you're doing it." So he did it, and then he left, didn't come back. At which point, that's when he gets suspended because he failed the drugs test, you know, a month earlier. So it's all about, and all of that is kind of known in different snippets, but it's about getting it in the right order and making it make sense, you know.
Right.
So,
yep.
And that's been the fun part of it, really.
Yeah, and it's crazy, like the stuff we talk about, like Murray Hodgson, Tom Cole, Rita Chatterton. I mean, there's so many other stories and other names people might not even remember. Like Murray, I'm sure people don't really remember, but he left and then he came back, right? He wanted his job back, technically.
So Murray Hodgson's an interesting character. So yeah, he obviously he left and was fired, released, and then he sued. And well, he jumped on the bandwagon is what he did, you know, when the scandal started to hit, and he was like, "Oh yeah, you know, I got sexually assaulted by or approached or whatever it was, you know, by Pat Patterson. It was implied to me that if I didn't sleep with him, I'd be fired, and I refused to sleep with him." And the thing about Murray Hodgson is he was very well spoken and came across very well on television, on Donahue especially, and because Vince doesn't come across well, because he always comes across as Vince, Mr. McMahon, essentially, you know, he gets no sympathy whatsoever. So he just looks like this complete jerk. And Murray Hodgson looks like this, like, you know, really affable guy who's been wronged by this awful, evil promoter. And I don't think really that is what the case was, but it was certainly presented that way. And then the evidence that followed all of that was quite clear that Murray Hodgson had done this before, you know, he'd done this kind of thing before. So there was a bit of a pattern there. And he then, he was so down on his luck because he wasn't getting anywhere with this lawsuit, I guess. And he had this expensive apartment that he'd bought or leased because he got this WWF job. And he's like, "Well, I can't afford to work, so, you know, I'll reach out and see if I can get a job with the WWF, I think it was, actually." And so, well, that probably isn't going to help your case, you know. And he was just like, "Well, you know, I need money." It's like, "Well, yeah, but you tend not to try and get it from the person you're suing. You know, it doesn't look great, you know, if you're willing to work with them again." And then it just kind of disappeared, that one. It got sold. The judge threw it out and basically character assassinated Murray Hodgson. It's like, well, we don't believe it. And it turns out Murray Hodgson is now a quite successful businessman, running drag queen live shows, I believe. So, well, good on him. He's bounced back.
Yeah, look at him. And if you talk about like WBF, obviously that was the World Bodybuilding Federation. That was Vince's other foray into business that year. Probably not the greatest idea when you're getting involved with the steroid scandal and that kind of trouble. And you bring in Lex Luger as this huge star. I mean, everyone knows Lex Luger's huge wrestling name, but he's going to WBF because he can't be in WWF because he couldn't wrestle, right? Because of his contract at WCW ended in February and he just left. So basically, oh, hey, we got Lex Luger's a huge star. Hey, WrestleMania, we're adding another huge name to WWF. Oh, but he's not in WWF, he's in WBF. Weird stuff. Another kind of like swing and a miss there, 92.
One of many. I mean, the WBF in general is a very Vince thing to do. It's like, I'm being investigated and like there's a lot of heat for steroids, so I'm going to launch a bodybuilding federation where they're all in steroids. And of course he is, because Vince, like he's gonna fight back. He's gonna aggressively fight back, and that's what he does. No one's going to tell him no, right? He's not going to have it. So and obviously watching bodybuilding is really boring, for most people. So unless you're really into that, which obviously Vince is, and Vince thinks that if he's into it, then everyone's into it, which isn't true. And what they were trying to do by making it into the WWF, by giving everyone gimmicks, these crazy gimmicks, and it's just the bodybuilding fraternity hated it. The wrestling fans couldn't care less. So who was it for? I think Bret Hart says, he's like, who's it for? Who was this supposed to be for? And there's an audience of one, and it's Vince McMahon. And the Luger thing made a lot of sense because it was trying to cross that, that divide between wrestling and bodybuilding. It's a big divide though it is. Maybe if we've got this wrestler, then people will watch it because like Luger's involved. And which is why they also tried to get Lou Ferrigno, the Incredible Hulk, and he was going to be part of it, and it was going to be, I think, Lou Ferrigno versus Gary Stridham. It was like the big showdown, the up and coming guy and the old veteran, and like for the title and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, yeah, okay, it makes sense to kind of do this, but who cares? And then Ferrigno left because they decided they were going to start testing people because of the steroid stuff, and he was like, I'm not having any part of that. And at which point Luger's in, but Luger came in because he was sick of WCW, at that point, and he called them and said, look, I just want a break. And they were like, okay, as long as you don't wrestle, we'll let you out your contract. He's like, okay. And then he called Vince, he's like, I'm out my contract, but I can't wrestle. How about I come to WBF? And Luger's, genius. He just gets to sit there working out, show up on 1 or 2 TV shows a year, and then get paid very well for it. I mean, not take a bump. Clever guy. And then what obviously happened to Lex was that he had that bad bike accident, and it meant he couldn't compete at the show. So it's another thing going wrong. Louis getting hurt, and not that he couldn't have wrestled, obviously, even if he hadn't got hurt, but it did mean the WBF was done. There was just no way. It didn't have any of its drawing power that it might have had. So it just died a death, and it was, I think all the bodybuilders went back, with the tails between the legs to the widers and had to kind of take less money. And
Sorry, but I lost you there for a second.
well, good.
But WBF, what a failure. The other crazy thing about 92, you were kind of talking about it before, Damien Demento, Doink, Nails, all these weird gimmicks that were just popping up that was Vince's idea. Even Razor Ramon to a certain extent, which actually was a good one, but like that was his kind of Max Moon, like that was his idea of creating new stars, these weird gimmicks.
It's funny. There's a whole chapter in the book going through each of those characters and sort of the I guess the story behind them. You know, where they came from, how they came about. You know, talk from the people who played the characters and about what happened. And in most of those cases, actually, it wasn't really Vince, you know, who came up with them. You know, Yokozuna, for example, was Sergeant Slaughter. Damien Demendo, I mean, he already was doing that gimmick. He was working as Mondo Clean on the Indies. They came up with the name. Vince loves some alliteration. I assume he's watched The Omen, which is where he came up with Damien. You know, and well, he's Demended, isn't he? So Demendo,
Yeah.
you know? Of course, yeah, it's very on the nose characters. Max Moon was, again, you know, that was Conan's gimmick. Until it wasn't, and then it was like, well, we've already paid a lot of money for this suit, and it was literally just Paul Diamond was backstage. He's like, "Oh, Vince, what are you doing with that suit?" You know, Conan hadn't turned up for this TV tape, and he's like, "Oh, why?" He's like, "Oh, I think I might fit in it," and he was like, "Oh, yeah, you know."
Yeah.
And then like a few minutes later, he's like, "Oh, Paul, that thing you were saying about the suit, like, try it on," and then it did fit him. So it was like, "Well, we can't call him." And they'd been through like a bunch of names, Comic Kid, and you know. Is it Rempalago or something like that? A bunch
of Rempalago, yep.
Yeah, and it was like, okay, well, Max Moon, you know, it's like, that sounds futuristic and kind of, I guess, you know. So these characters were kind of already there. They're just, the issue for Vince by 92 was a self-made problem. He'd killed the territories. He'd killed everywhere that mattered. So where was he getting stars from? He couldn't bring in, if he was bringing in anyone from WCW, he couldn't just steal the gimmicks, you know, and he wouldn't do that anyway, as we've seen over the years. He doesn't like that. You know, he wants to own the IP. Yep. So in the past, he'd have had Memphis, he'd have had, you know, Texas, he'd have had the Carolinas, he'd have had all these different places where he could have got people who were wrestling in front of good crowds. They were draws within their own territories, and they were established. You know, people forget that guys like Dino Bravo, who were mid-card guys in the WWF, were huge stars in their own region, you know. So you haven't got that anymore because all the regional groups are dead, and you've now got the indies rather than the territories, and the indies are very, very low level and infrequent. So who have you got? Where have you got to draw from? And in terms of a talent pool, which obviously they realized many years later, and well, after initially seeing ECW as a talent pool, you know, obviously after that they realized we have to create our own, and there wasn't anything really 92, 93, 94, which is why you get these just atrocious gimmicks or very bang average wrestlers or guys who've at best worked in Memphis for a couple of months, you know, and who aren't brilliant, you know. They're not great, and they're not really at that level to be mainstream global superstars. So it was tricky. So he kind of went with what came to him, what was presented to him in terms of the talent, and like I say, he didn't have a lot of checks and balances going on. So he just went with whatever sounds good, pal, you know. So.
Yes. Yep. And it's funny too. It's like, let's bring back Kamala, you know, let's bring back Bob Backlund. Like, he's trying everything in 92, like to drum up something like crazy what he's trying there in 92.
It's a really strange one with the older guys, because it's like, well, they've been used and worn out, and they're done, right? That's why they were got rid of in the first place in the 80s. But I guess what's old is new again by 92. So it's like, well, I'll turn to Bob Backlund. He can help us draw on the house shows in New York, which he didn't. And, you know, it's like, oh, Kamala, I need a monster heel, which to be fair, I see the logic in that. But at the same time, you've got this guy coming in who's not presented as a monster heel anymore because the WWF's become completely cartoonified. And instead they present him as this guy who, you know, he's an idiot. You know, he's an idiot, you know, and it's like, well, an idiot is not a threat to The Undertaker or Bret Hart or Ultimate Warrior. It's like, there's no actual threat. He's not this cannibal like he used to be, or back in the 80s where he's this vicious heel. It was very, very, very cartoon.
Yeah, very cartoonish. Yeah. Definitely a different Kamala than the guy that wrestled Hogan. Yeah.
Right. Of course. Yeah. And because that guy, you know, was headlining and doing good houses with Hogan as well, and was a viable threat in people's eyes. And And by 92, he was just a cartoon. And as entertaining as I think he was, he was a cartoon. And I think actually Nails was probably the most intimidating heel they had, in terms of intensity. And he was quite, genuinely frightening. And I guess Papa Shango was frightening in his own way, but they were just silly gimmicks, weren't they? They were never going to be top guys. And I think that was obvious. But he was just throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what would stick, right? So,
yeah, it's almost like, hey, we got to do something here. You know what I mean? Like, we're shrinking over here, literally and figuratively. We need to do something. Nails or Kamala. It was crazy when you look at it. And it's like, okay, then maybe we need Hulk Hogan back. It's one of his, which is crazy, but maybe we need to go back in that direction. Like Vince was lost.
Who would, if Hogan had came back earlier, who would you worked with? You'd have had the same problem.
Yeah, no idea. Yeah.
It's like all your top stars at that point are baby faces. So who have you got? I mean, Flair again, Razor's not ready yet. You've turned Kurt babyface, and even if you hadn't, you've already done Hogan and Perfect 2 years earlier and done that into the ground. So what do you do? Like which is, why when he came back in 93, it was like, hey, well, we don't really have a lot for Hogan. I guess we'll do him with Money Inc. It's like, okay.
Right. Yep.
That's kind of underwhelming. It's where's the big monster who's been killing everybody for him to work with? And that was the obvious thing. I mean, Yokozuna would have probably made more sense, to be honest, and give Bret a better WrestleMania program than that, but it didn't happen that way, obviously, which no doubt I'll get to in the next book.
Yeah, that's right. Damn right. It is like, what an insane year. I mean, we're just like scratching the surface here, obviously, because everybody needs to go out there and get the book. But man, there are so many like stories that it's like, it is almost like insane. It's like Texas Tornado, the Legion of Doom, Bret winning the title. What about Tito? What about Taker? What about Jake? What about Warrior? What about Sid? What about Hogan? What about Flair? Hey, what about Vince? This trial, that trial, this trial. Oh, by the way, Bruce Pritchard's fired. Pat Patterson's gone. JJ Dillon's basically working by himself. It's like, ooh, what a year. Crazy year in WWF. Maybe, like we said, maybe the most insane year ever in WWF.
It's pretty relentless. I mean, in terms of the book, I've had a couple of people get in touch since it came out, and it was just like, oh man, I got through it in a day. I just wanted to keep going because there's just so much in it. I'm like, oh, that's great, and it is relentless. It's just sort of one thing after another, after another, after another. It doesn't pause for breath. There's no sort of, downtime at all. It's just kind of onto the next drama and onto the next drama. And even because I always do try and include WCW in these books because they're relevant down the line. And one of the criticisms actually I had about it from a friend who read it was like, I don't get why the WCW chapter's there. I'm like, well, it informs what's going to happen. Like you need to know where WCW is, because when we get to 95, if you read these as a complete, double trilogy, because I don't know what the real word is, then it's WCW becomes very important, obviously, to the story. So you need to kind of lay the groundwork for what's going on. And what was going on there was just as wild, because you have Bill Watts coming in and, just instead of WCW going, right, WWF's on a downward spiral, they're struggling, you've got the steroid situation, Vince is in trouble, Hogan's in trouble, we can really capitalize here. Instead, they were like, let's go back 10 years. Yeah. Let's bring in Bill Watts, who, has, I'm sure, a lot of great ideas and they all made sense to him, but not for the era. They were completely wrong for that time. It was dated. And, they just failed completely to capitalize on this downward spiral that WWF was on. And they had the talent for it. They really could have done it. And they did try and go, best foot forward with the steroid thing, get on top of that and bring in these new policies and change things. But it didn't work. It didn't come close to working. But they did do some good stuff with, Ron Simmons getting the title was a big thing for wrestling and for WCW and for a lot of reasons. And it does lead into sort of 93, which will be, Bischoff coming in and 94, which will be Hogan coming in, because they're all relevant. Like, so you need to kind of lay the groundwork for that. But yeah, that was, I thought that was important to be in there.
Very, very important, because you want to know what's going on there. Because eventually they'll take Typhoon and Neidhart and Bulldog, and you know what I mean. They'll take a Hawk, and like they'll take a bunch of the WWF guys anyway. Flair goes back, so and it's very relevant, and obviously a lot of talent does exchange hands. Even Luger leaving WCW to go to WWF, and Kid Fry and Watt and all these other guys that you're talking about in the book.
It's all relevant. And because Jake as well, like Jake leaves in 92, and that's a big part of it. And then obviously what happens with Jake is Bill Watts comes in and goes, rips his contract up, says, there's no way I'm paying you that. And so it's relevant, but you can't really say that happens without saying, well, who's Bill Watts? Well, what's he got to do with it? Why has he done that? Well, what's Bill Watts doing? So they are together, they are intertwined, the WWF and WCW throughout all of this era. They just are. You can't tell the story of one without the other. It doesn't.
And Watts will be booking WWF in '95, so
exactly. So it's a nice introduction to if people, let's assume someone was reading this quadrilogy, no, it's more than that, double trilogy, without knowing anything about wrestling. That this was the first they learned of any of this stuff. If you read about Bill Watts in '92, you're like, oh man, that guy sounds hard work, And then when they get to him in '95, it's like, oh wow, that guy, So I think it's important to have that. Sometimes you have to assume that people don't know everything about wrestling and history, So.
Yes, you gotta do everything from the ground floor and then build it up. Yes.
That's it. That's exactly it.
As we wind it down, head toward finish, give us one last big push for Titan Shrnking and where everybody can get it.
Sure, man. So the last big push is, look, you might know a lot of these stories, but you don't know them like this, in this much detail, and this much, coherent order, So there's definitely, in terms of the feedback I've had, a lot of people saying, wow, I knew a lot of this stuff, but the detail and the little things really sort of, bring it to life. So, which is very, very nice of them. And that's always the idea with these books, is to try and do that. Add a little bit of context and add a little bit more information through the interviews we do and the research we do and things like that. So even if you do think you know it inside out, I think hopefully, you can still learn something from reading it. At the very least, I think you'll enjoy revisiting, what, like we said, one of the most fascinating years in WWF history. And you can buy it from Amazon all over the world. It's available in paperback and in ebook form if you prefer to do it on your Kindle. And you can also buy it from InsideTheRopesMagazine.com.
Get out there, get Titan Screwed, Titan Sinking, Titan Shattered, and also Titan Shrnking, How Wrestling Muscle Lost Its Power. Man, James, awesome series of books here. Awesome stuff. Thank you so much for all the time today. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Before we let you go, where can everybody find you, social media-wise?
You can't.
Okay. I was going to say, I forgot to mention your social media.
No, I don't bother, man. I think it's a toxic place, and I don't think it's worth. I'd rather spend my time writing than reading a bunch of nonsense.
Nice. All right. Perfect then. Okay. All right, everybody, get out there, get Titan Shrnking, the newest on the next part of this double trilogy. James, thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thanks, John.